We need to talk about factory-sealed Nintendo 64 games. In a world where Mario 64 once sold for $1.56 million, it's pretty important these days to know what is authentic and what is not. The thing with factory-sealed N64 games is that there are a few rules that exist, and then there are a ton of exceptions. I made a video quite a while ago talking about factory-sealed Nintendo games in general and how to identify some of them. With NES, Super Nintendo, and original Game Boy, it's honestly pretty easy. You'll see either this horizontal or vertical seam running down the back of the game, which connects on the side. You'll also see these symmetric patterns of vent holes on the front and back of the wrap. And that's going to cover like 98% of factory sealed games on those consoles. Yes, exceptions exist, like unlicensed NES games or even licensed games published by Acclaim will use some weird seal patterns. The Majesco releases on Super Nintendo will also use some different seam patterns, but for the most part, you just need an H seam or a V seam, and it's an authentic factory sealed game. Assuming it's not also a reseal, but we'll get into more information about looking at the actual box itself as well in just a bit here. The thing with Nintendo 64 is that yes, it does still use the typical vertical seam pattern you can find on Super Nintendo games, but instead of it covering like 98% of examples on the system, it's only going to cover around 50%. And even when these games do use a vertical seam pattern, you can also find variants, like with Ocarina of Time Collector's Edition, which can be found with a vertical seam, a vertical overlap seam, and a 3-side seam pattern on it. All three of them are legit. So say thank you to every single patron who helps support the channel as well as the YouTube members. I can't do this without you guys. Hit the like button and let's do a deep dive here into Nintendo 64 factory seals. So like I said, this is your standard vertical seam seal pattern that you're still going to find on majority of N64 games. The issue is that a lot of collectors think this is the only seal you're going to find on N64 games and that this is the only legit seal you're going to find on N64 games. This video I'm making here actually does stem from a Reddit thread, which I really have to stop going on Reddit, but there was a Reddit thread where someone found a factory sealed Super Smash Bros. For N64, and a lot of people were quick to jump out and say, oh, that Smash 64 is a reseal there because it doesn't have a vertical seam pattern, like factory sealed N64 games need this specific seal. And the Super Smash Bros. Was 100% legit, and what it had was a vertical overlap seam. This seam pattern can be found on a handful of games like Super Smash Bros., Ocarina of Time, Perfect Dark, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. My Conker's here is open, but it actually still has most of the original seal on it. What makes this seal pattern different is that it's actually flat on the back and about 1 inch wide. It connects to the top and the bottom, and it honestly looks invisible if you're looking at it from far away. You can see side by side how different it is from a typical V-seam, and you still have vent holes present on the front like you would with any other seal pattern. Basically, you're always going to have vent holes on the front and back. That's a pretty hard rule with N64. If you do not see vent holes on your sealed game, that's like a major red flag, so just keep that in mind. And with the vertical overlap seam here, it's basically never faked, which is nice. A lot of people don't even know it exists, and if you do, it's like, why would you try to replicate this niche, weird seal pattern here when you could try to fake the much more common one or a much easier one? But let's say someone did reseal this Conker's Bad Fur Day, and this is what I'm talking about when I say you can also look at the box to identify reseals. Let's say this Conker's was now resealed. You can look here at the actual hinge on the game, and from being opened over and over, I want you to notice the white line of paint cracking here. When these cardboard boxes are opened repeatedly, this is a type of wear that develops. With sealed games in general, if something has truly been sealed for all of these years, there's a lot of very specific wear patterns that simply cannot exist. This is one of the most important spots to check when you're looking for reseals, so make sure to keep that in mind. It does get trickier when people also attempt to fake the boxes. Like here is a blatantly fake Mario 64 reproduction that I guess has been sealed as well. The box isn't even using a V-seam, which Mario Kart 64 only ever came with a vertical seam pattern, so you immediately know to stay away, but let's say you didn't know that. Hopefully you can tell even in this photo how oversaturated the colors on the box are. Here's a side-by-side to hopefully make it easier. Most people aren't actually going to try to create a perfect reproduction box as well as a perfect reproduction seal. It kind of gets into the territory of being almost impossible, but it's definitely something to be aware of, as reproduction boxes, cartridges, reproduction everything is pretty rampant these days. The vertical seam pattern itself, of course, being the most common seal pattern, people will also try to fake that. Some quick, good signs of a real one are that on either end of where the seal ends, there will be this puckering here on both the top and the bottom, and where the seal itself meets, there will often be this little triangle or this little bit of overlap. It's not completely straight where the two seals meet. If you see a vertical seam where it's perfectly perpendicular, the top and the bottom seam, seam, that is almost always a red flag. Like I was saying though, most people aren't going to try and fake this seal pattern. It's just not worth it. Most of them are just going to use a quick 3-side shrink wrap type of seal, and unfortunately, a lot of authentic factory sealed N64 games also use these kind of seals. So with these 3-side seams, it's exactly as it sounds. The seam wraps around 3 sides of the box. There is no seam on the front or the back of the box. There's no V or H seams whatsoever. But even with these 3-side seams, not all of them look the same. There's variance in this as well. V-Rally 99, for instance, is using this very thick seam pattern and has many vent holes all over the front and back. Cruisin' Exotica is using much smaller seams on the side, and though it still has a lot of vent holes all over, they're much smaller. All-Star Baseball 2000 and some other Acclaim published games have what are probably the ugliest seals on all of factory sealed N64 games. It's this 3-side pattern here that isn't even straight or consistent in its application. It looks like the seal machine was basically drunk, or maybe the person operating it. You still have your vent holes, of course, that never changes, but you can start to see how many people who come across these would-be factory sealed N64 games are likely to think they're just blatant reseals. I mean, they look awful. And to make matters worse, some third-party games like Hexen here from GT Interactive or this hockey game from Midway, they are using normal vertical seam patterns. And then you have this South Park game that's published by Acclaim that's using this weird horizontal seam across the back, which is also different from every other seam we've looked at today. So even certain publishers will change which seal pattern they use for different games. Like I said at the start of this video, NES and Super Nintendo original Game Boy is very easy compared to N64. There was order, there was uniformity, there was consistency with how the games were sealed. By the time the N64 era rolled around, different publishers, games, whatever, man, it was a complete free-for-all out there, which is really weird because you'd think uniformity would have increased over the years, but I guess they started caring less. But even with all of this madness, there are some rules to keep in mind here to look for reseals. Always look at your box, look for wear on the hinges, look for wear underneath the cellophane that simply can't exist if a game was sealed forever. Check for your vent holes. Like I said, I don't think you're gonna find a single factory sealed N64 game that doesn't have vent holes. And if you're really unsure, if you're looking at a game like Power Rangers on N64 and you're like, man, does this have a V seam? Is it supposed to be a 3-side seam? You can go to eBay and check any other factory sealed copies of a game you can find. If every other copy is also using a 3-side seal pattern, it's pretty likely that that is the proper seal that exists on the game. Or at least you can have a little bit more assurance, right? I might try to create a big spreadsheet that lists every Nintendo 64 game and the seal pattern that it can be found with. That would probably be a good resource for us to have at this point. I still have about 70 sealed N64 games myself, so I mean, that's like a quarter of the list done right there. Let me know if that would help you guys out. Let me know what you think of factory sealed N64 games and the wild seals that are all over the place. Hit the like button before you go, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.